On a bleak industrial estate in the West Midlands, a cash and carry warehouse, nearly 70,000 square feet of cheap toys and fancy goods. An unlikely starting point for the most potent scandal to sweep through a British police force in a decade. On a winter night 3 years ago, Hooty's warehouse was burgled for the second time in less than a month. Today, the repercussions are echoing around the police stations of the West Midlands and the prisons of Britain.
Everyone who's ever had, in the last 3 years, control operation of the Serious Crime Squad has been moved out sideways.
An unprecedented show of strength from a chief constable pushing more than 50 officers into desk jobs after disbanding one of the top teams of detectives in Britain. The Hooty's warehouse burglary started a chain of events which led to downfall and disgrace for the crime-fighting elite who investigated it, the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad. Within 3 years of a routine inquiry into an everyday burglary, around half of the squad's detectives have been investigated or disciplined, suspended or charged with criminal offences, all over allegations that confessions have been faked.
My determination to see a thorough inquiry into these matters is unswerving and quite ruthless.
Now the chief constable has called in another force to probe the work of his own men. 500 cases are being investigated. It's the biggest inquiry into alleged police wrongdoing since the purging of Scotland Yard in the 70s. Tonight, World in Action examines some of the cases hidden away behind the scandal of the Serious Crime Squad, and we reveal how a police force delayed and misled courts and judges to cover up for its elite detectives. November 1974, the Birmingham pub bombings. 21 people killed and 162 injured by IRA bombs in 2 pubs. It remains the most important case ever tackled by the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad. The 6 Irishmen convicted of the bombings claim that some squad detectives conspired with other police to force and fabricate confessions from them. Their claims have always been rejected and they're now in their 16th year in prison.
My terms of reference are as follows: to investigate individual complaints made against members of the West Midlands Police Serious Crime Squad.
Yet today, Donald Shaw, Assistant Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, leads a team of detectives investigating whether there's been a police conspiracy in the 80s, the very thing held to be unthinkable at the time of the pub bombings in the 70s. The scandal has brought calls for the reopening of the Birmingham 6 case from unlikely quarters.
We've now had this Serious Crime Squad problem. I have a feeling that had the Court of Appeal heard that, they might have well have taken a different opinion. And the more you see these straws blowing in the wind, the more you think there are still unanswered questions about, is it vengeance? Is it the police bluntly being happy to say, well, at least we've got somebody? Or is it justice?
Initially, the investigation will relate to matters occurring in 1986 to date.
The Birmingham pub bombings in 1974 remain outside the scope of Mr. Shaw's inquiry. Boasting the swooping eagle as their own emblem, the Serious, as the crime squad were known, achieved a formidable reputation over more than 30 years. 20 or so detectives worked in pairs, targeting the worst of criminals, mainly armed robbers, and sometimes petty criminals too. 6 months after the Hooty's burglary, local detectives still hadn't solved the £30,000 crime. On a summer morning in 1986, the Serious Crime Squad took over the case.
The Serious Crime Squad, I didn't even know what it meant. It was approximately 7 o'clock in the morning. Doorbell went. So I came downstairs. There was these 2 chappies standing at the door. And they said, "Clifford Jones." I said, "Yes, that's me." And they showed me this card, Serious Crime Squad.
Clifford Jones worked at the warehouse. The detectives suspected he'd been the inside man who'd given the thieves information. He was one of 4 who received an early morning visit from the squad. They told Jones he'd be taken to a local police station.
When they said to me they'd take me to Wigan police station, I said to them, could I take my working clothes with me? Because where I work is only 2 minutes up the road, and obviously I could go, when they sorted this mistake out, I could just continue and go on to work, and that'd be it.
A convoy of unmarked cars took Clifford Jones to Willenhall police station.
The officer in front of the car was questioning me about what had happened. He said, I'd done the job, throw your hands up. I didn't know what he meant by throw your hands up. Then he said, you know you get a fistful for this. And I said, what's a fistful? And he went, 5 years.
A new law had been introduced 9 days before the burglary at Hooties. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, laid down rules on how a suspect had to be treated by the police. He should usually be allowed to speak to a solicitor.
I did say, can I have a solicitor? And that right was refused. Because I was under the impression anyone that was arrested was entitled to have a solicitor there. But they said, no, this is too serious a crime. We have the right to refuse you the right to see a solicitor.
PACE made it much harder for any dishonest policeman to make up evidence. Richard Ferguson, who's represented the Birmingham Six, says police have to be particularly determined if they're to sidestep the law.
To get round the provisions of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, it requires a much more concentrated, a much more thought-out conspiracy by the police involved, and therefore, if it has happened, it would show that there has been a concerted and serious effort to foil the ordinary system of justice.
Under the new law, a police interview should usually be written down while it's going on, question by question, answer by answer.
I was questioned what I knew about the robbery, which I said nothing. My involvement in it, which was nil. I just made a complete denial. And that was it. I was then taken back to my cell.
Detective Sergeant Michael Hornby interviewed Clifford Jones. He'd served on the crime squad since 1972, playing a part in most of its major inquiries, including the Birmingham pub bombings. Hugh Callaghan, one of the Birmingham Six, now serving 21 life sentences. The evidence against him, a disputed confession, taken by Sergeant Hornby. Detective Constable Hugh McClelland, Sergeant Hornby's long-standing partner on the squad. He made notes of Sergeant Hornby's interview with Clifford Jones.
I told the police that I hadn't got any involvement, and it seemed at this stage I was quite happy with what I told them. And they put me back in the cell. I thought, another half an hour or so, they'll say, OK, Cliff, off to work.
Clifford Jones wasn't a likely burglar. His criminal record consisted of a petty theft more than 20 years ago. Yet 3 hours after denying the crime, he was charged with it. It was only when he saw a copy of the interview notes he understood why.
I read them, the first 2 pages, quite authentic. The next page I couldn't believe. It was the start of a confession. I was absolutely horrified. I said, I can't believe this. Things like this don't happen. You know, you trust the police officers. I've always had greatest respect for them. And here I am, I got this confession saying I'd done this burglary at Hooties.
While Clifford Jones was protesting his innocence, the Serious Crime Squad was following its roving brief across the Midlands, back to another crime local police hadn't been able to solve. When detectives in Wolverhampton questioned Lewis about a burglary, he had a solicitor there, denied it, and was released. 6 days later, he was in another local police station being interviewed again. But this time it wasn't only the local police, it was the Serious Crime Squad. Detective Sergeant Peter Reynolds asked questions and made notes. He'd questioned a suspect in the Jones case too. Detective Constable John Perkins also asked questions. As Sergeant Reynolds' partner, he too had been involved in the Jones case. They said Lewis had signed away his right to a solicitor. Glenn Lewis was to claim that when he tried to sign to say he wanted a lawyer, a police officer knocked the pen from his hand.
Sure enough, there was this biro line going through, and then instead of going right through, it halted part way and went down, absolutely consistent with his instructions to me that his hand had been knocked aside while he was trying to delete that line.
Lewis was to make incredible claims about the interview which followed in the station's medical room. Another officer threatened him with a hypodermic syringe, he said. He was so frightened, he signed blank sheets of paper. A confession was written out to burglary and robbery.
He was very agitated, he was upset, he was crying, and between sobs he said, "Mr. Dawson, they've set me up." I think his words were, "They've fitted me up with some robberies and a burglary that I didn't do."
A few weeks on, notes from another case were to be subjected to unusual scrutiny. Robert Radley is a forensic scientist specializing in the analysis of documents. He examined Clifford Jones's confession to the Hooties warehouse burglary. In Mr. Radley's hands, the papers were to yield remarkable evidence. He's one of the few independent scientists who can carry out sophisticated tests called ESDA.
If I write a statement, this is a statement, so on and so forth, the underlying sheet will have impressions from this writing. If we now put it on the machine and carry out the examination, we should be able to visualize the impressions from that original writing. The ESDA technique is a highly sensitive technique for highlighting and visualizing those impressions.
ESDA was a technique whose time had clearly come. It will make hidden words develop from paper like images on a photographic slide. First, an electrostatic charge. A sensitized powder spread over the plastic sheet will pick out impressions of handwriting invisible to the naked eye. The powder will trace words, but not any which have actually been written on the paper. It will highlight the traces of letters which have been written on the sheet above.
We now have, this is a statement. We have an impression of the original writing, which can be seen as black writing on a grey background. This can be used to superimpose with the original writing to ensure that that impression is indeed from that original writing.
When Mr. Radley put the 5 pages of notes from Clifford Jones's interview through ESDA, the results were breathtaking. Reassuringly, traces from the text which had been written on page 1 could be detected clearly on page 2. On page 2 itself, 140 words had been written. Yet no trace of any of the words written on page 2 appeared on pages 3 or 4.
If the pages were resting on top of one another, I would certainly have expected to have found impressions from page 2 on page 3. There were no impressions on page 3 of any significance, nor on page 4.
More remarkably, impressions of part of the text from page 2 did appear on page 5.
That, in my opinion, raises a possibility that pages 3 and 4 have been inserted at a later point in time.
The finding was all the more critical because the first 2 pages and the last page of the interview recorded Clifford Jones totally denying any involvement in the burglary. But pages 3 and 4, which Mr. Radley believed might have been inserted later, had Clifford Jones admitting he'd helped plan it. Dudley Crown Court. Clifford Jones came here for trial in the summer of 1987 and met the barrister representing him.
And he said, the bad news is you're not going to get tried today. And I looked at him in amazement and I said, well, if that's the bad news, what is the good news? And he said, the good news is we can prove beyond doubt that your statements have been tampered with.
Clifford Jones was to have appeared before Judge Christopher Stewart White. When the trial was postponed, the judge went on to hear another crime squad case. Glenn Lewis appeared before him charged with burglary and a robbery he'd admitted to the crime squad. He'd claimed to have confessed under the threat of a hypodermic. Sergeant Reynolds and Constable Perkins had taken Lewis's confession quite properly, the jury decided. They were unaware the same officers had played a controversial role in the Jones case. Glenn Lewis was sentenced to 10 years. Today, he's in a high-security prison in Worcestershire.
If Lewis's trial had been heard after the Jones trial, when those officers were, as I understand it, discredited, then it may well be that his denial of the confession would have been accepted. The judge could conceivably have excluded the evidence completely, and Lewis would never have been convicted.
Clifford Jones appeared before Judge Stewart White with his 3 co-defendants soon afterwards. Despite the forensic evidence supporting his story, he was afraid.
I was just terrified. I was frightened I was going to go to jail for 5-7 years for something I'd never committed.
Detective Sergeant Hornby, who'd asked the questions in the interview, testified that the notes had never been tampered with or fabricated. Detective Constable McClelland, who'd written down the questions and answers, gave almost identical evidence. But the timing of an interview with another suspect was to seal the fate of the case. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act says interviews have to be timed, with notes made of the time they began and ended. Detective Sergeant Danny Lloyd had interviewed the man. The notes, he said, had been read back to the suspect when he refused to sign them. The process had taken 14 minutes. Detective Constable Lawrence Shaw had written down the questions and answers in which the suspect was said to admit a part in the burglary. He testified that the interview was completed and read back in 14 minutes.
Tests were conducted at our offices by a number of people to see whether or not those notes could be written out in 14 minutes, and quite simply, our tests led us to believe that it was impossible.
In court, a remarkable challenge was issued to Detective Constable Shaw: write the interview out again against the clock.
And he looked in amazement, and he looked at the judge, and he had to accept. His face went completely white. It was a picture to see it. And he held onto the witness box. His legs really went. He was ready for collapsing, and he had to hold on for dear life to stand up.
It took Detective Constable Shaw 21 minutes just to write out the interview he and Sergeant Lloyd said had been completed and read back in 14 minutes.
It quite simply showed that the police officers were not telling the truth about it. The prosecution's case was so tainted that the learned judge quite clearly felt that it would be unsafe to allow the matter to proceed to a jury.
Judge Stuart White directed the jury to acquit Clifford Jones and the suspect interviewed by Lloyd and Shaw. The prosecution withdrew charges against 2 others. The judge asked for a police inquiry into the squad's conduct. While Clifford Jones celebrated his freedom, in Birmingham's Winson Green prison, another young man on remand was going mad.
Well, I was in the cell in the afternoon and I broke my wristwatch and used the glass from that to cut my wrists. But you can imagine what my state of mind was to put myself in that position by cutting my wrists.
Dandy was arrested after a robbery on a cash truck in which a security guard was shot in the leg, and he was interviewed by the Serious Crime Squad.
The only account I could give him was where I was on the day in question. I told him exactly where I was, who I was with, who I called for, who I missed, who might have seen me, and whatever. I told them everything they needed to know.
Detective Constable Lawrence Shaw, the squad member who failed the timing test in the Jones case, made the notes of Dandy's interview. Detective Sergeant James McManus asked the questions. The officer said that Dandy had made an indirect admission to the robbery.
Well, I couldn't believe it. It wasn't what I'd said. They was like, they'd written their own story kind of thing. They put what they wanted to put.
An ESDA test on one of Dandy's interviews proved that 2 pages had been rewritten and that the incriminating admission appeared only in the second version of his interview.
I'd have probably killed myself if I was in prison doing 15 years or whatever for a crime I never committed, because I wouldn't have been able to wait 2, 3, 4 years, however long it had took for the appeal.
Paul Dandy was cleared on the 3rd day of his trial. In the face of the forensic evidence, the prosecution withdrew the charges. With the collapse of a second case after Clifford Jones's acquittal, a pattern was beginning to emerge. Dandy's MP took up the case in the House of Commons.
One of the things I did was ring around some solicitors in the West Midlands and Birmingham to ask them what they had to say about this case and what was going on. And I got a series of horror stories of similar events, of papers lost when the court had ordered that they be released to the defence.
In 2 cases following Dandy's, the prosecution agreed to hand over original interview notes for forensic examination. The notes were lost in the half-mile journey from police headquarters to the Birmingham office of the Crown Prosecution Service. In Paul Dandy's case, an internal police inquiry established an explanation from the detectives for the rewriting of his interview. In a tussle, Dandy had grabbed and torn part of the notes, and the interview had to be repeated and noted a second time.
The police wrote down an answer which I never says, and so I snatched up a piece of paper, tore it in half and threw it onto the table.
According to the police account, in the tussle, a cut had opened in Detective Constable Shaw's hand. Part of the notes had become crumpled, torn and blood-stained, and therefore had to be written out again with Dandy. Dandy insists this never happened.
There was no blood on it. There's no... At any time whilst I was in Queen's Road Police, there was no blood off me or off any of the officers.
The detective's explanation was accepted by the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Police Complaints Authority and the Chief Constable. 3 detectives, Shaw, McManus and Detective Superintendent John Brown, were reprimanded by the Chief Constable, the second mildest sanction, for neglect of duty. The piece of paper had been thrown away. MP Claire Short protested to the Police Complaints Authority.
There was a big flurry, and they then sat me down and assured me that they were deeply worried about what was going on in the West Midlands amongst the Serious Crime Squad. Deeply worried.
The public fear that where you have an investigation into police activity carried out by policemen, the danger is that those investigating will not be as diligent as they should be in getting at the truth. And the fear is, first of all, a lack of diligence. Secondly, the fear that even if they do come across something which is wrong, that they will in some way or other try to stifle that or hide it.
It was the charging and acquittal of Ronnie Bolden which finally led to the disbanding of the Serious Crime Squad. Bolden spent the 70s in jail, convicted of an armed robbery. On a summer afternoon in 1987, he was arrested by the Serious Crime Squad. He'd been seen in a part of Birmingham where there'd been a robbery. In a series of interviews, he was alleged to have made incriminating admissions.
They didn't so much as ask questions, as they just made accusations or suggested things like that I was going to be doing 15 years or more in prison, 18 years, that my kids would be grown up when I went home and they'd be calling someone else dead. My wife was going to lose her house, they'd make me bankrupt and things like this.
Among the officers who questioned Ronnie Bolden was Detective Sergeant Michael Hornby, veteran of the Birmingham pub bombings and also involved in the Clifford Jones case. With him was Detective Constable Hugh McClelland, his long-serving partner on the squad, who'd also been responsible for Clifford Jones's discredited confession. The 2 officers recorded that Bolden had offered them a bribe.
Of £10,000. The first we heard about this was about 3.5 months after my arrest. I was in Winson Green. I applied for bail through the High Court, and it was then that the police claimed that I'd tried to bribe them for bail. And it was a ridiculous suggestion.
In their case against Bolden, the squad were to use remarkable and unconventional tactics. Bolden's lawyers, meanwhile, had heard of allegations against the squad in another case. They decided to visit this man in prison. A robbery charge against Paul Fitzsimons had been withdrawn after doubts were raised about a squad officer's credibility and an exhibit lost. In Birmingham's Winson Green prison, he gave one of Bolden's lawyers an account of his dealings with the squad. Later, he received another visit from 2 squad detectives who asked about the solicitors.
He's put 2 pieces of paper on the table, and he's gone to me like, it's a guy, telex from Telford, to rearrest me on my release for another robbery what happened in Telford. And he said that if I was to turn around and say that this firm of solicitors has offered me money to give false information for Ronnie Bolden, that they'll brush the robbery under the carpet and that they'll send me all right when I've got it.
It couldn't really be more serious. One would imagine it would lead to, if true, charges of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. It could mean the end of a firm like this.
And had that firm of solicitors ever offered you anything or acted improperly in any way?
No, not whatsoever. All he'd done, he was come to me, asked me what the officers was like. He's took notes down, and that was it. There was no mention of money whatsoever. That was put into my mind by the 2 detectives.
Detective Sergeant McManus filed an internal report setting out the allegation against the solicitors. He named Paul Baker.
We eventually were able to show the prison gate book that showed that I hadn't visited the prison on that day at all. As it happened, when I looked to see where I was, I discovered that I was in Golders Green police station with a client who was suspected of murder. Officers there were from Scotland Yard Serious Crime Squad, and I was there for a 2-day period. including the very afternoon when I was supposed to be offering money to a man in Birmingham.
The allegation halted Bolden's trial. In a retrial, he was acquitted after spending nearly 2 years in prison. The following day, the squad was disbanded and its detectives transferred to other CID units.
You don't ever believe that sort of thing would happen to you. There's no reason why it should happen. And when it does, it's like being in a nightmare, and that, you know, you think, is the nightmare going to go on, or, you know, is the truth going to come out? And luckily for me, the truth did come out.
In some of the West Midlands Crime Squad's cases, the truth has yet to come out. In Part 2, we show how the force has tried to cover up for its elite detectives. Carnarvon in North Wales, an unusual spot in which to expect any protest about the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad. Yet this is a protest song in Welsh about the jailing of a man from Carnarvon, Hassan Khan. In the appeal court next week, it will be alleged that the squad fabricated evidence against Khan. In some cases, there is evidence of the West Midlands police force misleading the courts about the crime squad. Khan's friends hope the evidence in his case will lead to his being freed. Detectives from the Serious Crime Squad believed Khan was the man who'd sprinted through a Birmingham shopping centre after snatching £10,000. The robber had shot 2 pursuers. There was, however, a factor which made Khan an unlikely suspect. 6 weeks before the robbery, he'd had 2 toes amputated. He was still recovering.
Could never, ever have done that if he would have seen his foot at the time. Never. He couldn't even put a shoe on to run.
At 2 o'clock one morning, Serious Crime Squad officers arrested Khan in North Wales. An unusual confession was to follow. By the police account, there was a 45-minute conversation in the car, but no formal interview. Detective Sergeant Michael Swinnerton said that during the journey back to Birmingham, Khan confessed to the robbery. By the light of a lamp slung round his neck on a strap, the officer wrote down the conversation word for word. At the time, Detective Sergeant Swinnerton had been up for 21 hours. As well as making notes, he asked the questions. Dr. Malcolm Coulthard is an English language specialist at Birmingham University. He's analysed disputed interview notes in a series of crime squad cases, including Khan's.
Normally, people can remember verbatim up to about 40 words. The research is fairly clear on that. And the problem that the officer had was that at times there were stretches in excess of 100 words, which he had to simultaneously remember and write down.
Khan claims no notes were taken in the car and that he confessed to nothing.
The record of the conversation that we have, when read aloud, lasts only 6 minutes, even though the total time it is supposed to have taken is 45 minutes. It suggests that it's a very inaccurate record of a 45-minute conversation.
Hassan Khan has a long criminal record and several witnesses identified him as the man who'd carried out the Birmingham robbery. Yet in Carnarvon, there are other witnesses supporting his story that he was here, 130 miles from Birmingham, at the time of the robbery, late on a Saturday afternoon in September 1987. There's evidence, too, about the state of his injured foot. The evening before, he says he was drinking at the Prince of Wales Hotel. The barman was Michael Roberts.
At the end of the night, he'd come over, they were going to some party or they were going whatever, and asked me if he could have some bottle of pills to take out with him, and he didn't have enough money to pay for them, and asked me if he could, you know, pay in the morning, which I thought, well, you know, he's not going to run away with 6 bottles of pills, you know, anyway, I gave them to him.
A friend of Khan says that the two of them returned by taxi to the pub the following lunchtime, the day of the robbery. Ken Owens says they took a taxi because of the state of Khan's foot.
You couldn't put any weight on it or anything. When he used to get out of the chair, you had to give him a hand to lift him up because he'd get his balance or anything. We went up to the bar, bought some drinks. I started talking to the guy behind the bar. He paid for the drinks and he paid some money as well that he owed the guy from before, some other time.
He came in about lunchtime and come over to the bar, gave me £6. I asked him what it was for, and he says, oh, you know, the bottle of pills I had last night.
Must have been about 3:15 when I left. I went over because by 3 o'clock they pulled the shutters down.
Ken Owen says he and Khan went back to Khan's home by taxi and the two men parted company towards 4 o'clock. Khan's brothers ran a fish and chip shop in Carnarvon, and Khan says that by 5:30 that evening he was working there.
I arrived at the chip shop about 6:30 p.m.
Ian Murphy was then a 16-year-old schoolboy who worked in the chip shop at weekends. He's certain Khan was there that Saturday night, about an hour after the robbery had taken place 130 miles away.
Hassan Khan was there, serving behind the till, sitting on a stool, with his foot heavily bandaged, and he was hobbling around the shop when he did travel. He left about 10 o'clock, and I worked till closing time then with his other brother.
Earlier that week, Kanan Jones had borrowed £10 from Hassan Khan to celebrate his 18th birthday. During the Saturday evening, he called at the chip shop.
I looked in the chip shop. Hassan was looking through the window. He saw me. He called me in, yeah. And I said, oh, Hassan, yeah, you're 10 there, yeah, thanks, and all that. We stayed there until 10 minutes talking to him. We bought a bag of chips, and then we went downtown.
The sprint the robber made through the shopping centre would have been impossible for Khan, according to witnesses who saw him that day.
Must be bionic. There's absolutely no way a fella in that condition could run anywhere. Could hardly walk, even on run. It's impossible. Never.
But when the Serious Crime Squad went to North Wales to check Khan's story, some witnesses became scared. Most were interviewed at Carnarvon police station with Khan's solicitor present.
Like, they didn't actually say to me that I was telling lies, but that's the impression I got, yeah.
Yeah, they told me you can get sentenced for perjury. They said words to the effect that, do you know what the charge of perjury carries? It's serious, and would you like to drop out of this now? He came towards me forward, and he said to me, we're not like these Carnarvon policemen, dickheads, he said to me. Like he was trying to say, we mean business, yeah?
What did it make you decide to do about giving evidence?
I didn't want any of it. I said to myself, I don't want any of this. No way.
In the end, were you frightened about giving evidence?
Yeah, he made me think. I was scared because the way he was talking to me.
If Khan's appeal fails next week, he faces another 13 years in prison. Chief Constable Geoffrey Deere believes malpractice within the squad may have started in 1986 with the introduction of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. Others believe it to have been more deep-rooted and long-standing. July 1980, Dudley in the West Midlands, and a classic armed robbery. It was the work of the most devastating team of armed robbers ever to operate in the Midlands, the Thursday Gang. £280,000 snatched in seconds. Their violent and lucrative raids were answered with the region's biggest police effort, codenamed Operation Cat.
Operation Cat was a very sickening case, and one which I hope never to go through again. Whatever respect I had for the police at that stage, which was still fairly considerable, as far as the crime squad concerned, disappeared. One knew that in the future, whenever you had a dealing with the crime squad, you had to be trebly on your guard. You mustn't trust anything that went on.
Donald Brown was arrested by the Serious Crime Squad just before Easter 1982 and questioned at a Birmingham police station.
They kept on saying that I was going to get 15 years imprisonment. I said, but you can't give me 15 years imprisonment. I ain't done nothing.
Donald Brown's brother, Ronnie, had been arrested months earlier. He was to be charged as one of the ringleaders in the Thursday Gang and had been remanded to prison, where he'd only be interviewed with a lawyer. He admitted nothing. The Serious Crime Squad took over the case with the arrest of this man. Keith Morgan, a burglar and robber, turned supergrass and named accomplices. Arrests followed at Easter 1982.
When the squad arrested everybody else on Maunday, Thursday 82, we were refused access point blank. They used every argument they could think of, and eventually when they ran out of arguments, they just said, get lost.
Donald Brown says that when he was interviewed, detectives offered him a deal and wrote out what could be said in court in his favour.
Then they turned around and said, you plead guilty to this charge, and we'll put this in front of the judge and get you a minimum sentence. He said, you'll be out. I looked at him and I've swept it away from me. I said, I'm not pleading guilty to a robbery that I haven't done. Well, the reaction then was for this one officer to pick it up, screw it up into a ball, throw it at me, which went over my left shoulder. He said, you brat. He said, what you gonna do now? We're gonna fit you up and get you 15 years imprisonment. He said, you're as bad as your brother you are. You won't help us to get him done, so you're as bad.
Donald Brown was said to have taken part in the Dudley robbery. Eyewitnesses gave descriptions of the man said to be him.
5'6", 5'8", 25, 28 years of age, shoulder-length blonde hair, no mask, with a pom-pom hat pulled down to the eyebrow. That was the description. Now, I'm over 6 foot tall. They said he looked like Borg, the tennis star, or Rod Stewart, the pop star. I would be highly flattered if I did look like that. And, you know, just no similarity at all.
29 people were convicted in Operation Cat. Their claims of police malpractice were dismissed by the courts and complaints about police conduct rejected.
Whatever techniques the officers had used, if you like, they'd been legitimised. They'd got away with whatever they'd done, whether it had been proper or improper. They got away with it, and they therefore knew that those techniques were allowed, in inverted commas.
Another of those arrested in Operation Cat immediately made horrifying allegations against the serious crime squad. Treadaway's wife saw him at a police station 14 hours after his arrest.
He said, well, I've been tortured. And he said they just came behind me and put plastic bags over my head, held them, so I was suffocating. And he said, I just thought I was going to die.
Dr. Derek Barrowcliffe was a Home Office pathologist for 30 years. He studied the findings of a police surgeon who examined Treadaway and found pinpoint hemorrhages on his skin.
They are entirely consistent with Treadaway's statement, Treadaway's allegations, that a plastic bag had been held over his head and sealed off at the top of the chest until he blacked out. Indeed, if I had been told that this had been carried out upon a man, the injuries that were found would be exactly where I would expect to find them.
He did that to him about 3 times. He said, you know, I'd have admitted I'd have killed the Queen, anything, he said, just for it to stop.
The police denied Treadaway had been ill-treated. Later this year, he pursues his claims in a civil action against the force and some squad officers. On parole after 7 years in jail, Donald Brown now has fresh documentary evidence showing that he was working in a house in Birmingham at the time of the robbery in Dudley. But his complaints against the crime squad won't be investigated. The current inquiry into the squad starts only with the introduction of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, in 1986.
I could have told them all this, 1982, which I have been telling them. And yet now it's emerging. But they won't take no notice of me.
The only difference that PACE made, in my view, is that the techniques used by the Serious Crime Squad became less blunt and became more sophisticated. By and large, Operation Cat told them that they, at the very least, could bend the rules to the extreme. Many of my clients say they went over the other side. But whatever it was, everything had been legitimised as far as they were concerned.
The Chief Constable believes only a few cases in 1986 and 87 suggested the possibility of wrongdoing by a handful of the detectives on the squad, that there was no evidence of a pattern of malpractice. He won't be in Birmingham to find out whether he was right. He's moving to a new post with the Inspectorate of Constabulary.
Well, Mr. Dear, the present Chief Constable, belatedly, he took this firm action that he disbanded the squad, and he's to be praised for that. But then he's resigned from his post as Chief Constable of the West Midlands before we have the outcome of the inquiry. before it all needs to be put right.
The internal inquiries into two serious cases had done little to inspire public confidence. In the case of Paul Dandy, where forensic evidence had suggested that an admission had been fabricated, 3 detectives had been subject to mild discipline. It had been decided the evidence didn't justify prosecuting any of them. In Clifford Jones's case, there was limited disciplinary action too. There were no prosecutions. 2 out of 6 squad detectives were punished.
It perhaps became politically necessary that the inquiry should come to the conclusion that there had been no gross wrongdoing in this case. The implications of any decision to the contrary would be very serious indeed.
Detective Sergeant Peter Reynolds, who'd interviewed one of Jones's co-accused, was demoted in the disciplinary proceedings for falsehood. Detective Constable John Perkins, who'd worked alongside Sergeant Reynolds on the case, was fined 13 days' pay, about £500, for a similar offence. Detective Constable Lawrence Shaw, who'd failed to write out an interview in the time he said it had taken, was cleared of falsehood. Detective Sergeant Danny Lloyd, who'd carried out the interview alongside Shaw, was also cleared. In Clifford Jones's own case, where forensic evidence indicated 2 pages could have been inserted into his statement, there was no disciplinary action at all. Detective Constable Hugh McClelland, who'd made notes of the interview, wasn't charged with any disciplinary offence. Neither was Detective Sergeant Michael Hornby, who'd questioned Jones. Quite the opposite happened. While the internal inquiry into the case was going on, he was awarded the Queen's Police Medal for distinguished service.
The temptation must exist, and police officers are only human, and occasionally they're going to succumb to that sort of temptation. My own view is that it is more serious at the higher levels, that the will to do something either doesn't exist, or perhaps even worse, a conscious decision is taken not to do something. That, I think, is far more reprehensible.
Chief Constable Geoffrey Deere finally ordered an inquiry into the squad and moved more than 50 officers sideways because of the case of this man. Michael Brommel, serving 7 years for wounding, claimed his confession had been fabricated. Last August, officers investigating his complaint searched through court files to retrieve the original notes for examination. 2 crime squad detectives had examined the file a few days before. Now, the notes couldn't be found. The chief constable feared they might have been stolen. He launched the inquiry into the squad. 53 officers, including dozens against whom there was no complaint, were switched to desk jobs. But across the West Midlands in the previous 2 years, 10 cases brought by the crime squad had collapsed in court. 24 people had been freed, most of them saying their confessions had been invented by detectives. The full story won't be known for at least another year. While dozens protest their innocence in prison, the inquiry is expected to run well into 1991.
Well, it is shocking to think that someone who's innocent, if it be the position, who has been convicted on false police evidence, should continue to be incarcerated for a further 18 months to 2 years. That I find appalling.
Some of the action West Midlands police did take has remained unknown until tonight. They covered up the possible extent of the scandal by deceiving lawyers and the courts. When this man was charged with a post office robbery, his lawyers asked if any of the squad officers who dealt with him had been under investigation and were told no. In fact, the senior officer in John Edwards' case was under investigation and was later disciplined in the Dandy case. When this man was charged with robbing a Birmingham post office, his lawyers asked similar questions and were told there was no inquiry into any officer in his case. In fact, one of the officers who interviewed Wellington was under investigation over Dandy's allegations. The officer was later cleared. In the case of these 2 men, the police misled not only lawyers but some of the most senior judges in Britain, the appeal court. Pelsall in the West Midlands, October 1980. A post office van held up at gunpoint, £103,000 snatched. It was 6 years later when Wilcox received an early morning visit from the Serious Crime Squad. Interviewed, he denied the robbery and made the astonishing claim that someone else had already been charged with it. He'd read about it in the newspapers.
I made verbal inquiries through the Crown Prosecution Service, who in turn contacted the police. But I was told in no uncertain terms that no one else had been charged with that offence.
That was untrue. Ronnie Brown, held in Operation Cat, ringleader in the Thursday gang, now serving 18 years, had been tried for the Pelsall robbery in 1983. When the jury couldn't agree, the case was simply left on file against him. Featherstone Prison in the West Midlands. This is the voice of Leslie Horrobin, now serving 14 years for the same crime.
There was one time when one of the officers said that they could do whatever they wanted because they were the serious crime squad.
The police said notes were taken of the interview, that Horrobin admitted taking part and implicated Wilcox.
And the officer said, "You're going to make a statement admitting this offence and your part in it." I said, "No, I want to make a statement denying everything." From that time onwards, no notes were taken.
The word of this woman had led to the men's arrest. Christine Patton, a neighbour of Wilcox and a self-confessed perjurer, told police they'd committed the robbery with her late husband. She also named another man as one of the robbers, whom we've traced. David Baker was never charged and no court has ever heard his story, but it gives a remarkable insight into the crime squad's handling of the case. He was arrested and taken to Walsall police station for questioning.
Well, I asked to read the statement but they'd made, and as I picked the paper up, I just couldn't understand a word that was on there because it was all just scribbly writing. And I said, you know, no way I'm going to sign this because I can't read it. They said, well, you either sign it or we remand you to Windsor Green Prison, you know, and lock you up.
Baker says he began to write his own unconventional caption on the statement.
I started to write on the statement that I couldn't understand a word it said on the statement, but I was going to sign it because I said I could go back to work. Well, they got very angry. We got very angry and started shouting and said we're doing no good with him and, you know, just dragged me out of the room, more or less.
Baker was released from police custody soon afterwards. Yet there was as much evidence against him, the word of one woman, as against Wilcox or Horrobin.
And they came down to me and they says, come on, we're taking you home. They said, we know you've done it, they said, but we win some, we lose some. You're going home. And 4 of them then took me to the car and they took me home then.
Horrobin's disputed confession to crime squad officers was the essential evidence in the case. When they appealed in 1988, they pleaded that some of the crime squad officers who dealt with them were under investigation. Mr. Justice Stocker dismissed their appeal. There were disciplinary proceedings against the officers relating to inaccuracies in records. Intriguingly, he said,
"Those records do not include in any case alleged admissions having been made by any of the accused persons in those proceedings."
But the judges had been misled by West Midlands Police. The force had written privately to the court in August 1988, detailing 2 investigations into the crime squad. Notes taken in 2 cases had been found to be unreliable, but, they said,
"It is of importance to note that there were no incriminating admissions in the notes."
The letter went in the name of an assistant chief constable. It reassured the appeal court that there was no question of officers falsifying confessions. That was misleading. In fact, one of the cases being investigated was that of Clifford Jones. It centred on allegations of confessions being falsified. The other case referred to in the letter was that of Paul Dandy. Again, an admission was alleged to have been fabricated. Confessions were the central issue in both cases. In Featherstone Prison last month, we showed the letter to Horrobin.
This whole saga, from start to finish, just a catalogue of lies, starting with the officers who investigated this crime, and then ending up when the higher officers notified the appeal court that officers were not under investigation.
What's your view of that letter containing as it does the misleading of the appeal court?
If it be so that this comment was signed by an assistant chief constable of any force, it is deeply disturbing, absolutely appalling, and something must be done about it, because if justice means this kind of injustice, then there'll never be any confidence in any police force.
Confidence in the police is likely to be the final casualty of the scandal in the West Midlands, as allegations are raised of evidence being fabricated in other forces too.
We have now had a number of instances in which we've had allegations of this nature, and clearly the more often this happens, the more people wonder about the quality of policing they are getting in this country.